You are listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture with Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb and Dr. Fredrick J. Long. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to ProveText. I'm Michael Halcomb, and I'm here with Fred Long. Fred, how are you?
Hey, I'm pretty good. Thanks, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm all right. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Looking forward to diving in today. It's been a little bit since we've been on Galatians. But, yeah, I think we're at Galatians 4, 16 and 17, I think is what we have in our site today.
Sounds good.
Is that right?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, we won't waste time. We'll just jump right in. I'm going to begin by reading verse 16 in Greek. And I think, Fred, something maybe that I'm going to start doing just briefly after I read these verses is just make a couple of points about pronunciation.
Sounds good.
I've had some, I've seen at least one comment on one of our episodes asking, for instance, about Veta and why it sounded like a V rather than a B.
Sure.
And so I can't remember who asked that, but if that was you and you're listening, the question was, isn't pronouncing Veta like a V a modern Greek thing? And the answer is actually no. The more novel or modern thing for Greek would be pronouncing B or Veta as B, which came essentially with Erasmian. Otherwise, it's always been a V sound. And we have manuscript evidence that makes that very clear. For example, in a vowel pair where you have epsilon, upsilon, it might be exchanged or interchanged with epsilon veta. So that tells us, right, that upsilon and veta both had that ev sound. There are other clues to this, but and I see one here that I want to explain just as we get going. So
you're saying,
Galatians,
to clarify, so you're saying that the modern Greek pronunciation, the betas are hard?
No. I'm saying from the Koine era up through Byzantine Greek, which is essentially the same as modern Greek, the pronunciation of veta was always a V sound,
Okay.
but the hard b came with Erasmian.
Yeah.
So it's actually more novel.
Yeah.
To use that, right? It's not historical.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear about the evidence of epsilon, upsilon being interchangeable with epsilon veta. That's really cool. I hadn't heard of that before. So great.
Yeah. So like Ev and Evcharisto, or just Ev by itself, could be epsilon, upsilon, or epsilon veta, right?
That'd be a scribal mistake, hearing it and then writing it as they would have pronounced it, rather than grammar.
I wouldn't use the language of mistake. It bothers me when text critics use that language. It's really just the ears are not failing them, so there's no mistake. It's just an interchange, is what I would call it.
Interchange.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Like F and PH. I mean, you could spell phone F-O-N-E or P-H-O-N-E, and if we're doing that by modern standards, we might call it a mistake, but really it's just an interchange.
Yeah, but if a scribe is copying something, then there's a certain expectation of accuracy, and if they don't match that accuracy, then there is some kind of mistake. But we can argue.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point. I mean, it gets into scribal practices, doesn't it? Like, were scribes looking at a text and copying, or was there someone reading a text aloud and they were copying by ear or transcribing by ear?
Yeah, and I think even then, the looking at it and reading it, I think what's been understood is that they recite it back to themselves. So they're hearing themselves. Because nothing was quiet. They're reading it out loud to themselves, and so they could have been, the source of the hearing error. Anyway, but okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I was thinking of a scenario where you have like a teacher and a disciple, and the teacher's reading and the disciples, I don't know, something like that. But we don't need to go into
that.
That
Could have been
but
ancient photocopying machines.
So let's go to Galatians 4:16, and I'll read the text here, and I want to make one, maybe two, but really certainly one pronunciation point. This is a question, and it sounds like this: Oste ekthros imon yegona alethevon umin. And the point that I want to make here is that fourth word, yegona. It is gamma epsilon, gamma omicron, nu alpha. Whenever you have an epsilon following a gamma, the sort of g sound evaporates, if you will, and turns into like a y sound. So it's not gegona, but yegona. So in the situation or in the context where you have epsilon following gamma, it forces the gamma to become a y sound. So yegona instead of gegona. Yeah.
Great.
And I'll stop there with that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let me go ahead and translate. Here we see something really kind of a little bit unusual. It does happen in Paul. You get the conjunction oste being used in an independent clause. We tend to think of oste as introducing a subordinate clause of result with the infinitive or sometimes with the indicative. But we don't often learn oste as an independent conjunction. And indeed it is. And it has an interesting processing constraint on how to relate this verse to the preceding context. Paul also uses it with commands, particularly in 1 Corinthians. Here, it's not a command; it's with the indicative mood, and then it's also in a question. So, so that have I become your enemy, even while speaking truth to you? Or although speaking truth to you, or because I'm speaking truth to you. Here we don't know exactly the force. How to render it in English is a little bit difficult. The participle alethevon, as it's a post-positioned, post-nuclear circumstantial participle, and if you've learned such participles, if you call them adverbial, you tend to start thinking of adverbial meanings. But this one, but I argue that and others, that they're not inherently marked for adverbial senses. So we kind of struggle, is this concession? Although I've spoken the truth to you, have I become your enemy? Or is it because? Are they, is Paul being a little bit snarky here that, because I've spoken in a certain way, you've rejected me? Is it because I've done this? Is it as or while or all along, which might be, it's a present participle suggesting ongoing kind of activity that Paul has. So oste, going back to oste, Levinson, I was just talking about his article, essay actually. It's called Wherefore and Therefore, What's the Difference? Therefore, wherefore, what's the difference? He looks at inferential conjunctions in Paul, and there's a bunch of them that he discusses, 7 or 8 of them at least. I can probably see here at least 7, maybe 8. But oste is one of them. Yeah, I think it's 7 of them. Actually, no, it's more like 10. There's a subsection that treats 3. So oste says, his discussion of oste begins with whether oste introduces an infinitive clause or an independent clause or sentence. It constrains what follows to be interpreted as the result, actual, natural, conceived, intended of what was previously stated. So may be characterized as plus inferential and plus result. And I think there's also something else going on with oste, which I think he also he says at the end, the very last sentence, Osta introduces a result that is not necessarily in direct logical relation to the immediate context, and often has more than one preposition as its input. Now here we have to pull that apart, and what does that mean? So it's not a direct inference being drawn from the previous sentence or proposition. It has a broader array of the propositions affecting it. Okay, so this is what I noticed in 1 Corinthians is that it comes at the end of an argument in and it has a summative function. So it really looks back over the broader section. Now, sometimes it's a chapter. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's 58 is where it occurs. It seems like it's looking back over all of chapter 15. Margaret Mitchell even thinks in her wonderful monograph, the Rhetoric of Reconciliation, where she looks at 1 Corinthians as deliberative rhetoric and studies it very thoroughly. It was a model for my dissertation. I was inspired by her very thorough work, and that's kind of what I was modeling in mine, looking at 2 Corinthians. Very influential in my life, my work. But she saw the Osta there as like looking back over all of 1 Corinthians. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's the result of some big ideas that Paul is consolidating. So anyway, really fascinating. Levinson's work is just so intriguing and helpful for me. It's a great article, like I said, Therefore or Wherefore, What's the Difference? And it's in a collection of essays from the book called Reflections on Lexicography, Explorations in Ancient Syriac, Hebrew, and Greek Sources. So it's kind of buried in this volume that might be kind of hard to get your hands on. So in some way, this question is summarizing multiple proposition points that are coming to this kind of head, and I think we could really say that it goes back at least to 12, maybe a little bit further, verse 12 of chapter 4. So,
what do you think of the simple translation of doing that? Osta is like, and so, right? Have I be,
and so,
like,
and so, I think that's kind of, I think it helps get at the result, or so then perhaps, and I've been looking at that for un, particularly when the conjunction un is resuming. There's a resumptive use of un after supporting material. So I think so then is kind of like returning to the main line. But I think and so then, or, and so in light of what I've been saying, have I become your enemy by speaking the truth?
I also like, I mean, if we separate the os, right, and the te and let them sort of do their own thing, like even something like as such,
indeed, or something like that, or exactly. I think it's good to pull apart things and look at them. Now, this verse it's prominent because it's bringing up a friendship topic of enmity, and Paul is eventually going to get really exasperated with them. In verse 20, he's going to say, I'm perplexed about you. So this kind of brings us to how this section in chapter 3 began. Who's bewitched you, Galatians? Paul, I think there's a transition taking place in these verses, and we'll look at that a little bit in the next verse. Verse 17. So something's kind of prominent there, that yegona is a perfect active indicative, first singular. So it's a perfect tense. This is I think it's a kind of a foregrounding or a front grounding. Have I become this? So Paul has become something to them. He's asking them, have I become an enemy? Have it become your enemy?
Yeah.
And so there's some natural prominence just because of the magnitude of this kind of relationship question. And then a little bit of an irony here too, because I'm speaking the truth to you, or whatever. The speaking the truth is typically associated with friends. Friends speak the truth to one another, and so there's something that is illogical about this, the need to even ask this question. There's something that's disconnected. You shouldn't become someone's enemy when you speak the truth to them. In fact, that is how friends should relate, is speaking the truth. So it's a very pointed question. And so I think we're reaching a moment here where Paul is in the context of asking them some hard questions. We've already seen that. And this is perhaps the hardest one that he has to ask them.
It reminds me of when you're in a hard conversation, or you're going to have a hard conversation with someone, or you're about to ask that hard question, and you're like, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Like that seems like what he's doing here. Although a little more rhetorical, I guess. Yeah. You want to move on to 17
Sure.
then?
Yeah, I think we're ready.
All right. He says, this is not a question. Zelusin imas ou kalos, ala eklise imas, thelusin ina aftus zelute. And let me make a point here. Just in the pronunciation, the omega and the omicron have the same sound, right? So they're both sort of a long O sound. You don't have to hold them out or anything like that, but they just have the O. So that's why kalos with the omega and ekthros here.
So those sounds were not distinguished at all. What does their name signify? Or were they distinguished by like how long they were held? So the omega is that mega because it's held a little bit longer, and the omicron, is it held shorter? And this is important, right? Because in terms of meter, the omicron is always a short vowel.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. If I'm not mistaken, my memory may be failing me at least partially here, but if I'm not mistaken, the word, the name's omicron, and it's actually two separate words.
Yeah.
The small and omega, the big, or the large, however you want to do that. Those are more modern inventions. If you go look at the names of these letters in the Greek alphabet, the name of omicron is actually to-u. And if you look at the name of omega, it's just to-o.
To-u and to-o.
Yeah. Yeah, so before all the letters of the alphabet, like you have to alpha, to beta, that neuter article, and so it would have just been u and o. They wouldn't have been called omicron and omega. Those are modern inventions.
And the u and o aren't clues to their pronunciation, huh?
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, so I think the omicron, probably the micron may have to do with the meter. So, Homer and other classical poets wrote in different kinds of meter that was based on the length of vowels and syllables. And so it gets pretty gnarly what these tragedians and poets do. Okay, so verse 17, we see right away that there's a syndeton. So there's a little break here. A syndeton indicates no relationship or close relationship. It specifies no one relationship. And so we kind of have to like figure out what that is. It can be like a rhetorical flourish. It could be a break. And I think here we have actually a break, a bit of a break, because we have a new party introduced into the more recent discussion. In any case, they are zealous for you. They're being zealous for you is not good. So not good is their zeal for you. But they want to church you. No, they want to shut you out. They want to shut you out. Now I'm intrigued by the word to shut out. And listen to it. Ecclesia. Ecclesia.
Yeah.
Which almost sounds like ecclesia.
Yeah.
So I've always wondered if that's an intentional play. Is that
like a pun?
That these are missionary rivals? I think is probably the best way to describe them. Sometimes they've been called, the zealots or the missionary rivals, the opponents. It's hard to describe use the right term, but they're somehow disrupting the Galatians and putting a wedge between the Galatians and Paul. And here Paul explains,
he called them troublemakers in chapter 1, right?
That's right, agitators.
And turncoats. He also called them turncoats.
Yeah. So they're wanting to cut you out, to cut you away, in order that they would be, in order that you would be zealous for them. So they're maneuvering. Basically, they're maneuvering to get a reciprocity of zeal, and they're showing zeal in a certain way, and then they're hoping that the Galatians would show zeal back towards them. So these are not good words. Did this come up in your dissertation, Michael? Thinking about change at all, or what thoughts do you have about zeal? Is zeal a good thing, bad thing, generally, or does it just depend on how it's applied?
Exactly. Yeah, it just depends. I do notice the uk Allah construction here going on. This is a nice little construction. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think the change just depends on the context. And in this case, remember, this always has to do with vice and virtue, right? So is it a vicious change or a virtuous change? Mm-hmm. And the only type of acceptable change is a virtuous one, from negative to positive. And in this case, it's not an acceptable type of change because it's actually a vicious type of change. It's removing them or attempting to move them from being zealous for what's virtuous to zealous for what's unvirtuous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so there's a purpose clause. Here at the end, the ina avtus zelute. There's also, I'm kind of intrigued by this. There seems to be a chiastic structure, but I don't know.
Yes,
I don't know what to make of it. So you have zelusin umas. On the outer end, you have umas thelusin. So those are, third person plural verb, and then the umas, and then in the middle you have a conjunction with an adverb, and then the corresponding al with an infinitive. So there does.
Well, I was seeing the chiasm differently there. I was seeing zelusin umas as the opening of the chiasm, and avtus zelute. Right, it starts and ends with the same verb essentially. This one's preceded with a pronoun. This one's followed by a pronoun. And then what comes in the middle, well, you have a u, and then an Allah. So zelusin u, Allah zelte. But that's how I was seeing it.
Yeah, I was looking. Yeah, I saw that differently, and it left the way that I was seeing it was leaving the ina clause separated. And I'm wondering if if that might be the point, is it leaves a disjunction. Sometimes I think when there's a weird structure of grammar, it actually helps support the point being made. It's an isolated purpose clause that's not included in the symmetry. If you read it the way that I was reading it, if you read it with the way that you're reading it, the middle is all kind of jumbled, right? The middle is you got the not well, but they want to exclude you. So you got the not well is one part of the middle, and the other part, there's a little bit of dissymmetry, but they want to exclude you. And so maybe that's, and in terms of chiasms, that actually makes a little bit more sense, because the center tends to be the causing element that causes the outer elements. So, I kind of like how you've done that. I think that probably works a little bit better, and it helps to accentuate that the main problem is the not wellness, which is that they're wanting to cut you out. And then this is the causative basis, or the means by which the zealousy is they want to work that for kind of an exchange of zealousness. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Just looking at this too, I should have used kalos here as my example and kalon here as my omega omicron, because they're the same word. But you have one's the adverb, right? One's the adjective. But yeah, so in a nutshell then, what are 16 and 17 doing to contribute to the argument? Like if you just had to put it in a couple sentences.
Yeah, the osta is signaling kind of a pullback, and it signals that there's multiple propositional points in the preceding context that are kind of being brought together in an inferential kind of way. I think there can be kind of it's a little bit of a summary kind of sense. I think there's kind of a distillation of an issue in terms of, have I now become your enemy while I'm speaking the truth to you? Like, this doesn't make sense. And then 17 with the asyndeton and the introduction of a third plural group that was mentioned earlier in the discourse indicates that he's now placing these people into the framework of the discourse. And that's why I think that these verses are preparing for what I would consider to be the refutatio section rhetorically. The refutatio is where you call out your opponents and you start to critique their arguments, you denounce them, and that denouncing is taking place right now. So I believe these verses just contribute to an understanding that Paul is transitioning from the main heart of his argument, 3:1 through 4:11, and now he's been asking some questions. He's talking about their past. He's talking about their present with these agitators, and eventually in 19:20, he's like, "Children, I'm perplexed about you." And then boom, I think something happens in 21. I think we see a move to a refutation, because he's addressing, he says, "Speak to me, those of you who want to be under the law." So there, he's calling them out. So to me, this has all the signs of a transition taking place to the refutation. But that's my own rhetorical analysis coming out. People will see this differently. But I did write a dissertation on this, surveying the breadth of forensic, accusatory, defensive rhetoric. So ancient rhetoric and Paul's apology. Yeah, I stand by that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Fred, thanks for the insights. We'd like to end with a parting shot here. I have one.
No, I totally forgot. I don't have one.
So I had one. Oh yeah. Here's the quote. For any sin, we all suffer. That is why our suffering is endless.
Wow.
Wendell
Oh man.
Wendell Berry.
Yeah. I have not read much of him, but I keep running across these quotes, and wow, that is spot on. Well, thanks, Michael. Thanks for all your work on these podcasts. And it's always fun to talk with you. I share with my students that this is a highlight. My wife, I just say I just really love doing this kind of thing and thinking deeply about the text and having you raise, great questions and possibilities and that kind of thing. So I really appreciate you, brother. So.
Yeah. Appreciate you too, man. And thanks to everybody else for supporting the podcast too and for listening. It's growing and we're excited about that. Help us grow some more. Spread the word. If you're into hitting like buttons on your social media, do that for us. And we'd be really grateful. So, if you haven't, make sure you subscribe to, go to our website, gloshouse.com, and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. It comes out once a month. We don't spam you. And every month we have some kind of sale. And you'll be the first to know about the sales in those weekly newsletters. So be sure to sign up for that and check that out. We got some great stuff coming up. So, yeah. All right. Until next time, aloha.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.